simply getting the better of her. It was entirely because her young daughter, Princess Charlotte, pulled a highly sensitive palace document directly out of her coat and basically detonated a massive family secret, completely exposing the ugly truth about Princess Diana's upcoming anniversary tribute. And the really truly wild part isn't even exactly what Charlotte bravely read out loud to the gasping audience. It's the handwritten toxic sentence sitting at the very bottom of the stolen page that she flatly refused to read, stating clearly that she said it would simply hurt her mother too much. That specific sentence, the one ending exactly why Catherine has been walking around looking utterly broken for weeks. So that's exactly where this whole explosive thing starts to get genuinely weird, because the official timeline absolutely doesn't add up, and the frantic official explanations leaking from Camilla's side are already completely falling apart under the crushing weight of their own contradictions. Before we go any further down this rabbit hole, I just want to say, if you're heavily into following complex royal family dynamics and the real stories hiding behind the sensational headlines, make sure you hit that subscribe button for my channel. We aggressively break down these tense situations as they develop. And trust me, this specific one is moving incredibly fast. So let's go way back to the very beginning, because the explosive story Charlotte bravely told on that stage absolutely didn't start that chaotic morning. It started exactly 8 weeks earlier, deep inside a quiet planning room where Catherine was sitting with a thick folder clearly marked for the 30th anniversary of Princess Diana's tragic passing. And from what we reliably understand from palace insiders, Catherine desperately wanted the upcoming ceremony to be profoundly different. She absolutely didn't want just another cold, stiff, formal event filled with distant, boring speeches and polished, meaningless language. She desperately wanted genuine warmth and authentic memory. She had painstakingly spent days personally going through dusty charity records, unseen old photographs, private notes, and heartfelt speeches. Her beautiful plan was incredibly simple on the surface. Exactly 30 white roses, exactly one for every single year since Diana tragically died, respectfully placed directly beside her statue in the peaceful sunken garden at Kensington Palace. Catherine genuinely thought that poignant gesture would finally return the heavy day to the specific people Diana actually cared about. Then there was the proposed film, a deeply moving short piece featuring absolutely no grand, swelling music or heavy, dramatic narration, just raw, honest images of Diana actively listening, warmly laughing, kneeling closely beside sick children, and bravely walking into intimidating rooms other privileged people actively avoided. Catherine fiercely insisted the young Charlotte had a highly specific, meaningful role too. She was going to respectfully carry the final 30 at Diana, but she grew up constantly hearing the warm family stories, the private jokes, the legendary stubbornness, and the unique way Diana could effortlessly make a stiff, formal room suddenly feel wonderfully less formal. Charlotte deeply wanted to read a few simple lines about learning true kindness from a beloved grandmother she only knew through other people's cherished memories. William quietly listened to the touching rehearsal. The bureaucratic title sounded completely harmless, something vague like ceremonial harmonization and protocol amendments. Incredibly dry language deliberately meant to actively discourage any probing questions. The first page boringly mentioned timing issues. The second droned on about maintaining balance between the various royal households. The third vaguely mentioned avoiding scheduling duplication. But the real devastating changes were hiding on page 4. Catherine's deeply personal introduction had been completely removed. Charlotte's poignant final rose placement had been abruptly reassigned to someone else. The moving Diana film was entirely replaced with a much broader, generic segment vaguely honoring women of royal service. An ultimate final approval was forcefully transferred completely away from Catherine's dedicated team. 4 massive changes, 4 brutal cuts, 1 unmistakable message. Catherine read that shocking page 3 times, desperately looking for a logical explanation, and there absolutely wasn't one. Diana's name wasn't completely erased. That would have been entirely too obvious and sparked immediate outrage. Instead, Her powerful presence was systematically reduced, deliberately softened, and quietly folded into something vastly safer and infinitely less specific. When Catherine politely asked exactly who authorized the massive revision, the chilling answer came incredibly carefully. The request had quietly moved through Camilla's powerful household. Nobody actively accused anyone directly, but the damning document had completely already done all the loud talking. Catherine strongly objected in strict private. She calmly explained that the original beautiful tribute had already been formally approved, expecting charities had already been officially contacted, and young Charlotte had already fully rehearsed her specific part. She was coldly told the newly revised program would significantly better reflect family unity and actively prevent the sensitive anniversary from becoming entirely too closely associated with exactly one specific branch of the family. Then came the chilling, undeniable warning. If Catherine aggressively resisted too strongly, the private disagreement could easily leak to the ravenous press. It could easily be presented as a petty, bitter fight over Diana's legacy. Even worse, it could be maliciously framed as Catherine cynically using the tragic anniversary specifically to strengthen her absolute own position directly beside William. And exactly that was the brilliant toxic trap. Fight back, and the beautiful tribute instantly becomes a messy, tabloid palace feud. Stay completely quiet, and long months of hard, emotional work instantly disappear. Catherine tragically chose agonizing silence, absolutely not because she agreed with the changes, absolutely not because the brutal cuts didn't deeply hurt, but entirely because fiercely protecting Diana's sacred memory from yet another highly public, messy argument mattered infinitely more to her than stubbornly protecting her absolute own pride. Now, this is exactly where the explosive story gets incredibly even stranger. Because the highly sensitive folder somehow reached Charlotte exactly 18 days completely before the scheduled broadcast. It mysteriously arrived completely with her boring briefing papers entirely for the Royal Youth Legacy Forum, quietly tucked beneath her mundane speech draft. A premium cream card, a highly official palace crest, a neat tied ribbon completely around the thick pages. Charlotte innocently opened it entirely after dinner. Absolutely most entirely of the dry material was highly familiar. Timings, seating charts, boring notes entirely about exactly where entirely to stand and exactly when entirely to move. But exactly then, a folded, hidden sheet quietly slipped completely out, entirely from completely between exactly 2 pages, and silently landed entirely near her chair. It was absolutely not meant entirely for her. The official heading used exactly that exact same, incredibly dry language Catherine had seen weeks earlier, but exactly this specific copy was entirely different. It explicitly had handwritten, angry marks, highly specific initials completely near the absolute bottom, and a significantly later circulation code. Charlotte slowly read the absolute First Amendment. Her absolute own name had completely been viciously crossed, completely out directly beside the final rose placement. She slowly read the absolute Second. Catherine's highly personal introduction had completely been brutally reduced entirely to a generic, boring welcome. Exactly then, the absolute Third, the emotional film entirely about Diana's massive charity work, had completely been utterly removed. Charlotte absolutely didn't deeply understand absolutely every single bureaucratic line, but she deeply understood exactly enough. Absolutely someone had maliciously taken exactly the beautiful ceremony her mother painstakingly built and aggressively changed exactly it piece completely by piece. Absolutely not entirely, because completely of timing, absolutely not entirely because completely of security. The damning paper clearly showed exactly something incredibly deliberate. Exactly one cold note explicitly referred entirely to actively maintaining proper distance completely between future representatives and past emotional associations. Charlotte slowly read exactly that chilling sentence exactly twice. Future representatives, past emotional associations. It sounded incredibly polished, but exactly it felt incredibly cruel. She slowly turned exactly the heavy page completely over and shockingly found absolutely another angry mark completely in significantly darker ink. The absolute lower part had completely been folded tightly inward. She slowly opened exactly it incredibly carefully. Catherine was absolutely to actively have absolutely no final approval. Charlotte's highly symbolic place was absolutely to actively be entirely reassigned. The entire Diana segment was absolutely to actively be entirely brought completely under exactly the Queen's household, and completely beneath exactly those strict instructions sat exactly one unfinished, incredibly toxic handwritten line, exactly that made Charlotte completely freeze. Diana must absolutely not be actively allowed entirely to... The ugly sentence abruptly ended exactly where exactly the heavy fold had violently torn completely across exactly the page. Charlotte completely stared exactly at it. Exactly that was exactly when the massive pieces finally came completely together. Catherine's incredibly quick fake smile, the tragically abandoned rose, the abruptly cancelled rehearsal, exactly the highly specific way William had completely gone incredibly quiet, exactly when, exactly the anniversary program happily came completely up. Exactly, this was absolutely not exactly a routine, boring revision. Exactly, it was exactly a massive aggressive warning. Charlotte quietly put exactly the highly sensitive document completely back, entirely inside exactly the folder, exactly then completely changed exactly her mind. Entirely if she simply returned exactly it, absolutely someone could easily remove exactly it. Entirely if she politely asked exactly a member entirely of staff, exactly the damning page could easily disappear completely forever. So she bravely carried exactly it completely upstairs and quietly slipped exactly it entirely inside, exactly a large book. Entirely for exactly 3 long nights, she bravely said absolutely nothing. Completely during exactly the day, she intently watched exactly her mother. Catherine dutifully attended boring meetings, politely answered mundane questions, and completely smiled entirely through highly public appearances. But incredibly small, subtle details entirely betrayed exactly her. She completely stopped happily mentioning exactly the film. She entirely avoided Charlotte's eager questions completely about exactly the rose ceremony. Exactly once she abruptly closed exactly the glossy program, exactly when Charlotte happily entered exactly the room. Charlotte finally boldly asked exactly her directly, exactly if absolutely someone had aggressively forced exactly her entirely to give completely up exactly the tribute. Catherine absolutely didn't answer completely at exactly once. She quietly looked entirely toward exactly the large window, exactly then quietly told Charlotte exactly that absolute duty sometimes brutally meant entirely accepting massive decisions, exactly that felt incredibly, deeply unfair. Charlotte boldly asked exactly whether exactly that actively made exactly the massive decision actually right. Catherine softly said, absolutely no. Exactly that single honest word completely changed absolutely everything. Because completely until exactly then, Charlotte had desperately hoped exactly there absolutely might actively be exactly an innocent explanation, a boring scheduling issue, a simple misunderstanding, a massive decision carelessly made completely without truly realizing exactly how incredibly much, exactly, it absolutely would hurt. But Catherine's honest answer completely removed exactly that tiny comfort. She deeply knew exactly it was completely wrong, and she was absolutely still actively protecting exactly the highly powerful people, exactly who had brutally done exactly it. Charlotte nearly desperately showed exactly the hidden note, but Catherine looked incredibly, utterly exhausted, and Charlotte deeply feared exactly the toxic page absolutely would infinitely deepen exactly the massive wound. So she bravely kept exactly it completely hidden, exactly while desperately trying entirely to finally understand exactly who had maliciously written exactly the unfinished toxic line. The highly specific initials clearly led completely back entirely to exactly a highly senior office entirely inside Camilla's powerful household. Exactly that massive connection clearly carried exactly its absolute own massive weight. A beautiful tribute heavily centered completely on Diana, warmly introduced completely by Catherine, and powerfully completed completely by Charlotte, absolutely would easily create exactly an undeniable image absolutely no strict protocol could ever possibly control. Diana's incredibly powerful memory absolutely would seamlessly move completely from William entirely to Catherine, exactly then seamlessly entirely into exactly the absolute next generation completely through Charlotte. Camilla absolutely would technically hold exactly the grand title, but Diana absolutely would forever hold exactly the massive moment. Absolutely someone deeply understood exactly that. Absolutely someone deeply feared exactly it. And absolutely someone aggressively decided entirely to forcefully move Catherine and Charlotte completely away, entirely from exactly the absolute center completely, before exactly the flashing cameras finally arrived. Exactly 3 short days completely before exactly the massive broadcast, Charlotte suddenly received exactly a completely new, sanitized version entirely of exactly her speech. The absolute final, touching reference entirely to Diana had completely been utterly removed. Absolutely no polite explanation, absolutely no gentle replacement line, just exactly an incredibly empty, jarring transition completely from Catherine's massive influence entirely to generic royal service. Charlotte slowly read exactly the sanitized speech exactly once, exactly then, quietly placed, exactly it directly beside exactly the highly hidden toxic document. Exactly that was exactly the absolute defining moment. Exactly her brave decision violently became entirely final. Completely on exactly the busy morning entirely of exactly the forum, she carefully folded exactly the damning note completely into exactly the inside pocket entirely of exactly her coat. She absolutely still absolutely didn't definitively know exactly whether she absolutely would actually reveal exactly it. She absolutely only deeply knew she absolutely would completely not ever leave exactly it completely behind. Exactly at Kensington Palace, Catherine lovingly adjusted Charlotte's collar and warmly told exactly her absolutely not entirely to actively be incredibly nervous. Charlotte intently looked exactly at exactly her mother and bravely said she was absolutely not incredibly nervous completely anymore. Catherine warmly smiled, completely, utterly unaware entirely of exactly what exactly that brave answer actually meant. Minutes completely later, Charlotte confidently stepped entirely toward exactly the large stage, actively carrying exactly 2 completely different speeches. Exactly the boring one formally approved completely by exactly the massive palace, and exactly the highly explosive one she had completely definitively decided entirely to actually give. Exactly at 11 o'clock a.m., completely that bright morning, exactly the Royal Youth Legacy Forum officially began directly beside exactly the beautiful sunken garden. Eager young guests happily faced exactly a large stage, beautifully framed completely with stunning white flowers. Massive cameras heavily lined exactly the entire outer path. Board reporters fully expected exactly a highly polished, incredibly boring discussion completely about vague service, strong family influence, and heavy responsibility. Absolutely nothing outwardly appeared incredibly unusual. Yet, completely beneath Charlotte's heavy coat, quietly sat exactly the absolute one, single page, entirely capable, entirely of violently turning exactly a boring ceremonial morning completely into exactly a massive, explosive family confrontation. Absolutely no highly paid palace official had completely prepared entirely to successfully contain. Catherine proudly sat completely in exactly the absolute front row, completely with William directly beside exactly her. She flawlessly looked incredibly composed, exactly though she constantly kept nervously glancing entirely toward Charlotte's heavy coat. Charlotte had stubbornly refused entirely to actively remove exactly it completely before confidently walking completely on stage, and Catherine naturally assumed she was simply incredibly cold. Exactly at 11:18 a.m., Charlotte confidently approached exactly the main lectern. The boring opening flawlessly followed exactly the highly approved, safe plan. She politely thanked exactly the various youth organizations happily attending. She articulately spoke entirely about true kindness, strong discipline, and exactly the massive example proudly set completely by dedicated women, exactly who quietly served completely without ever demanding cheap attention. Her clear voice resolutely stayed incredibly steady. Her small hands quietly rested completely on exactly the thick pages. Exactly then, she dramatically turned entirely to Catherine. Charlotte beautifully described exactly a loving mother, exactly who confidently entered absolutely every single room, actively thinking exactly first completely about exactly the highly vulnerable people, absolutely nobody, exactly else had absolutely ever actively noticed. Catherine warmly smiled. The large audience enthusiastically applauded. William proudly looked entirely toward exactly his wife completely, with incredibly quiet, massive pride. Exactly the speech absolutely should definitely have completely ended exactly there. Exactly it absolutely did completely not. Charlotte slowly lowered exactly her eyes entirely to exactly the absolute final paragraph, exactly the highly specific one, aggressively rewritten exactly days incredibly earlier. She slowly read exactly the absolute first safe sentence, abruptly stopped completely halfway entirely through exactly the absolute second, and violently fell completely silent. Exactly 5 agonizing seconds slowly passed. The highly nervous moderator awkwardly shifted completely in exactly her chair, desperately ready entirely to quickly move completely on. A panicked producer frantically raised exactly one hand completely near exactly the massive cameras. William's intense expression abruptly sharpened. Charlotte deliberately moved exactly the highly approved safe speech completely aside. Exactly the loud sound entirely of thick paper, harshly sliding completely across exactly the wooden lectern, incredibly seemed intensely, unusually loud. She bravely said exactly there was exactly something massive she had completely been explicitly told, absolutely not entirely to publicly discuss precisely because exactly it supposedly belonged strictly completely within exactly the highly private family. Exactly then she bravely added exactly that toxic silence had completely, already actively caused incredibly enough massive pain. Catherine's warm smile instantly disappeared. Charlotte aggressively reached completely into exactly her heavy coat. Exactly at 11:24 a.m., she dramatically unfolded exactly the damning palace note. A massive, shocked murmur violently moved completely through exactly the entire audience. Exactly the highly recognizable royal crest was glaringly visible. Catherine instantly recognized exactly the highly toxic document completely immediately, absolutely not entirely because she had absolutely ever actually seen exactly that absolute exact specific copy, but precisely because she intimately knew exactly the strict format, exactly the highly specific spacing, exactly the incredibly dark ink. She frantically whispered Charlotte's name. Charlotte bravely looked completely directly entirely at exactly her shocked mother and loudly said exactly the beautiful anniversary tribute entirely for Diana had absolutely not simply completely been politely adjusted. Exactly, it had completely been aggressively, maliciously dismantled. Catherine's highly personal introduction was completely gone. Exactly, the moving film had completely been utterly removed. Charlotte's highly symbolic place directly beside exactly the final rose had completely been abruptly reassigned. Absolute final approval had completely been maliciously taken entirely from exactly the specific household exactly that painstakingly created exactly the beautiful ceremony. Exactly, the massive cameras violently turned entirely toward Catherine. She completely froze. Charlotte bravely continued. She clearly explained exactly that she had shockingly found exactly the toxic note completely among exactly her boring briefing papers and bravely kept exactly it completely hidden entirely for exactly 18 long days. She had painfully watched exactly her exhausted mother politely smile completely in highly public exactly, while intimately knowing exactly that long months entirely of incredibly hard work had completely been ruthlessly taken, completely away, entirely, without absolutely any argument, absolutely any polite explanation, or absolutely anyone even actively asking exactly what exactly it brutally cost exactly her. Catherine desperately shook exactly her head exactly once. Exactly the panicked word stop absolutely never, ever actually left exactly her frozen mouth, but Charlotte deeply understood exactly it. She absolutely did completely not actively stop. She loudly said exactly her exhausted mother had fiercely protected exactly the massive family completely by loyally remaining incredibly silent. She loudly said exactly the massive family had absolutely not fiercely protected exactly her exhausted mother completely in return. Exactly, that massive, devastating sentence completely changed exactly the entire room. William aggressively leaned completely forward, exactly his large hands tightly locked. Exactly, the terrified moderator frantically looked entirely toward exactly the panicked production team. A massive camera aggressively moved significantly closer. Absolutely nobody desperately wanted entirely to actively interrupt. Exactly, yet absolutely nobody deeply knew exactly how incredibly far Charlotte fully intended entirely to actually go. Exactly then, Charlotte boldly left exactly the main lectern. She confidently walked entirely toward Catherine, actively carrying exactly the toxic note completely with absolutely both small hands. Exactly, each brave step noticeably slowed. Catherine frantically rose completely before Charlotte even reached exactly her, perhaps entirely to desperately shield exactly her completely from exactly the ravenous cameras, perhaps entirely to quickly take exactly the highly damaging paper completely before absolutely anything massive more was actively said. Charlotte gently placed exactly it completely in exactly her shaking hands. Catherine slowly looked completely down. Exactly, her terrified eyes quickly crossed exactly the highly typed cold instructions. Exactly then, abruptly stopped exactly at exactly the angry handwriting directly below. Exactly, her ragged breath violently caught. Exactly, one shaking hand quickly rose entirely toward exactly her pale face. She frantically turned incredibly slightly, desperately trying entirely to actively recover, but exactly the immense raw emotion violently arrived entirely too incredibly quickly. Exactly, the heavy tears completely came, absolutely not entirely, because Charlotte had publicly embarrassed exactly her, but entirely because Charlotte had intimately known. Entirely for exactly 18 incredibly long days, exactly her young daughter had bravely carried exactly an incredibly massive, highly toxic adult secret, intensely studied, absolutely every single heavy silence, and patiently waited entirely for absolutely someone exactly else entirely to fiercely defend, exactly the exhausted woman, exactly who fiercely defended absolutely everyone completely around exactly her. Catherine desperately pressed exactly the toxic note tightly against exactly her heaving chest. Charlotte gently reached entirely for exactly her shaking free hand. William rigidly remained completely seated, entirely for absolutely another tense second, intensely staring exactly at exactly the absolute lower torn edge entirely of exactly the damning page. Exactly something highly specific was tightly folded completely underneath, exactly a highly hidden toxic line. Charlotte clearly saw exactly him intensely notice. She deliberately placed exactly her small thumb firmly completely across exactly the tight fold and bravely told exactly the massive audience exactly there was exactly one highly specific toxic sentence she flatly refused entirely to actively read. Absolutely not exactly there, absolutely not completely in front entirely of exactly her devastated mother. Exactly the highly toxic words she bravely said were entirely too incredibly deeply personal, and exactly once actively spoken highly publicly, exactly they could absolutely never, ever actively be taken completely back. Exactly the entire forum violently stopped completely entirely. Absolutely no polite applause, absolutely no swelling music, absolutely only Catherine desperately steadying absolutely herself completely directly beside Charlotte. A highly panicked producer frantically signaled entirely for exactly the terrified moderator entirely to quickly move completely on. Exactly the terrified moderator completely ignored exactly it. William aggressively rose. He absolutely did completely not actively take exactly the highly toxic note completely from Catherine. He coldly asked Charlotte exactly one highly specific question, incredibly quietly, exactly enough, entirely, for highly sensitive nearby microphones, entirely to easily catch exactly it. Was exactly this, exactly the absolute only single copy? Charlotte bravely answered. She absolutely did, completely not actively no. Exactly that highly specific answer completely changed exactly his intense face, precisely because exactly a single stray page could easily be casually dismissed. A highly misplaced rough draft could easily be aggressively denied. A messy handwritten instruction could easily be entirely blamed completely on exactly one incredibly careless rogue official. But absolutely another clean copy absolutely would definitively mean massive coordinated circulation. Absolutely another clean copy absolutely would definitively mean highly deliberate malicious intent. Exactly when exactly the chaotic broadcast finally ended mere minutes completely later, William ruthlessly ordered absolutely every single heavy file explicitly tied entirely to Diana's beautiful tribute, completely secured entirely before absolutely anyone even left exactly the massive building. Internal emails, rough drafts, secure access records, messy handwritten notes, absolutely nothing whatsoever was absolutely to actively be entirely deleted, actively moved, or actively rewritten. Camilla's highly powerful household had absolutely not entirely yet actively responded. Princess Anne had absolutely not entirely yet actively entered exactly the explosive story. Catherine absolutely still had absolutely not entirely unfolded exactly the highly toxic final line, but completely by exactly high noon, exactly one massive thing was utterly, undeniably clear. Charlotte had absolutely, not merely completely broken, incredibly heavy palace silence. She had violently opened exactly a massive, unprecedented internal investigation. Exactly the heavy doors violently closed completely behind exactly the highly stressed family, exactly at 11:41 a.m. Completely outside, ravenous reporters aggressively shouted frantic questions completely across exactly the massive courtyard. Completely inside, exactly the loud sound, utterly, instantly vanished. Catherine quietly stood entirely near exactly a narrow, tall window, absolutely still, tightly holding exactly the tightly folded, toxic note. Charlotte bravely remained directly entirely beside exactly her, exactly as exactly the immense, crushing weight entirely of exactly what she had bravely done slowly began entirely to heavily settle, William quietly asked absolutely everyone exactly else entirely to quickly leave. Catherine slowly turned exactly first. Exactly, her quiet voice was incredibly controlled, but deep, raw hurt heavily sat completely beneath absolutely every single quiet word. She gently asked exactly why Charlotte had bravely carried exactly the highly toxic page completely alone entirely for absolutely so incredibly long. Exactly why she had absolutely not completely trusted absolutely either loving parent. Exactly why she had deliberately chosen exactly a highly public live audience absolutely instead entirely of exactly a highly private, quiet room. Charlotte absolutely did completely not actively defend exactly the chaotic broadcast. She bravely defended exactly the absolute core reason. She bravely said she deeply feared exactly the highly toxic note absolutely would magically, conveniently vanish. She had intimately watched highly approved, beautiful plans casually change, highly valid objections completely soften entirely into dead silence, and highly specific, important details quietly disappear. Entirely for exactly 18 long days, she patiently waited entirely for exactly an adult, entirely to forcefully correct exactly what had brutally happened. Absolutely no one actively did. Exactly that highly honest answer violently struck significantly harder entirely than absolutely any highly public, angry accusation, precisely because exactly it was undeniably, completely true. Catherine had desperately tried entirely to fiercely protect Charlotte completely from exactly the highly toxic conflict, but had tragically left exactly her completely alone entirely with exactly the absolute undeniable evidence. William gently held completely out exactly his large hand. Catherine quietly gave exactly him exactly the toxic note. He absolutely did completely not actively read exactly it completely, like exactly a highly concerned husband casually studying exactly something highly specific, exactly that had deeply wounded exactly his beloved wife. He intensely read exactly it completely, like exactly a highly trained investigator, desperately searching entirely for exactly the absolute precise moment, exactly a massive story permanently stopped actively making absolutely any logical sense. Exactly, the highly specific circulation code aggressively came exactly first, exactly then, exactly the highly specific timestamp, exactly then, exactly the highly specific initials, exactly the highly damaging page had completely been officially produced, exactly 6 long days, completely after exactly the absolute original, beautiful program officially received ultimate final approval. Exactly that, completely, utterly destroyed, exactly the absolute easiest, most convenient official explanation. Exactly. It absolutely could completely not possibly have completely been exactly an early, harmless proposal. Exactly. It had completely been highly deliberately created completely after exactly the massive tribute was completely, definitively settled. William coldly asked exactly where Charlotte shockingly found exactly it. She clearly described exactly the boring folder and exactly its highly specific position completely between exactly her mundane speech pages. Exactly at 11:49 a.m., he ruthlessly called exactly the anniversary program was absolutely to actively be entirely permanently preserved inside massive royal households, incredibly uncomfortable, highly damaging mistakes easily completely disappear entirely beneath significantly cleaner, sanitized language and significantly newer, boring paperwork. William was aggressively, proactively blocking exactly that incredibly convenient escape route completely before absolutely anyone even actively knew exactly they desperately needed exactly one. Camilla's highly powerful accidentally reached Charlotte's highly restricted folder. Exactly that sounds incredibly reasonable, right? Exactly, except William coldly placed exactly the toxic note directly, completely on exactly the massive table and intensely pointed entirely to exactly the highly specific date. Absolutely nobody actively answered, completely by exactly the highly tense afternoon. Terrified officials frantically claimed exactly the highly specific circulation number was completely, entirely wrong, and exactly the angry handwriting absolutely belonged entirely to exactly a incredibly junior, highly incompetent planner. Exactly each desperate, highly fabricated answer aggressively pushed absolute responsibility significantly further completely downward. Exactly then, the highly formidable Princess Anne finally arrived. She absolutely did completely not actively begin completely with Catherine's highly visible tears or Charlotte's highly explosive speech. She coldly, aggressively asked entirely for exactly the massive document index. A messy emotion absolutely could easily be endlessly debated, but strict, rigid procedure absolutely could completely not. She intensely examined exactly the highly specific code and ruthlessly requested exactly the massive, highly secure master register exclusively used completely by exactly the highly formal ceremonial office. Exactly the highly tense room completely changed exactly when she flawlessly found exactly the absolute matching damning entry. Charlotte's highly toxic copy explicitly belonged entirely to exactly the absolute fourth massive distribution sequence. Absolutely not exactly the highly innocent first, absolutely not exactly the highly harmless preliminary, exactly the absolute fourth. Exactly that explicitly means exactly this highly damaging document had completely been widely circulated exactly multiple separate times, explicitly meaning exactly it absolutely wasn't exactly a harmless, forgotten draft, simply sitting entirely in exactly a dusty drawer. Exactly it had completely been actively, deliberately moved completely through exactly the entire massive system. So exactly when Camilla's highly panicked people frantically tried entirely to smoothly say exactly it was exactly an incredibly early, harmless idea, exactly that absolutely never, ever actively went absolutely anywhere, exactly the highly secure paperwork completely itself loudly said entirely otherwise. Exactly, that's exactly the massive, undeniable contradiction, exactly that absolutely, really, truly matters, exactly here. Absolutely, you absolutely can't successfully claim exactly something was absolutely never, ever, exactly a final, binding decision, exactly when exactly the highly secure circulation log explicitly shows exactly it actively moving completely through exactly four completely separate massive distribution rounds completely after exactly the absolute original beautiful program was completely already definitively approved. Anne coldly asked exactly where exactly the massive third and massive fourth highly secure sequence files were physically stored. A terrified, highly junior clerk nervously led exactly her entirely to exactly a highly secured, heavily locked archive, completely beneath exactly the busy planning offices. Exactly one highly specific, highly marked space, completely in exactly the highly restricted Diana anniversary section, was completely, glaringly empty. A massive, highly sensitive file had completely been physically removed, but absolutely whoever hastily removed exactly it had incredibly stupidly missed exactly something massive. Completely behind exactly an older, highly boring program quietly sat exactly a incredibly thin, highly identical duplicate folder, completely with absolutely no identifying label. Anne smoothly opened exactly it and shockingly found absolutely another pristine copy entirely of exactly the highly toxic amended order. Exactly the exact same brutal removals, exactly the exact same harsh reassignment, exactly the exact same massive transfer entirely of ultimate authority, exactly a significantly later highly specific timestamp, exactly a highly senior household formal approval mark, and exactly the highly toxic handwritten sentence completely in absolute full. Anne calmly returned completely upstairs entirely without actively announcing exactly what she had shockingly found. She deliberately placed absolutely both highly toxic pages directly completely beside exactly each other completely before William. Exactly the absolute first seamlessly contained absolutely only exactly the angry beginning, exactly the absolute second seamlessly completed exactly the highly toxic thought. Catherine intensely looked exactly at Charlotte. Charlotte slowly lowered exactly her eyes. She had completely seen exactly enough entirely of exactly the toxic line entirely to deeply understand exactly why exactly her mother absolutely would be so deeply hurt, but absolutely not exactly enough entirely to deeply know exactly how incredibly directly, exactly it viciously targeted exactly them, absolutely both. Anne coldly tapped exactly the highly senior approval mark exactly once. Exactly, this was absolutely not exactly a harmless discussion, she coldly said. Exactly, this was exactly a direct, binding instruction. William intensely read exactly the highly toxic sentence completely without ever moving. Exactly then, he intensely read exactly it completely again, significantly slower. Exactly his immense anger absolutely did completely not visibly appear exactly as loud shouting. Exactly it incredibly chillingly appeared exactly as absolute terrifying stillness. Camilla's highly panicked representatives frantically continued, aggressively insisting absolutely no final formal authorization had absolutely ever completely been officially given. Anne coldly turned exactly the absolute second highly toxic page directly entirely toward exactly them and coldly asked exactly why exactly a supposedly discarded harmless idea explicitly carried exactly a highly specific late circulation number, exactly a highly formal approval mark, and highly explicit binding instructions entirely to actively replace exactly an officially authorized, beautiful program. Absolutely no one actively answered. William carefully folded exactly the highly toxic pages securely completely together and coldly said, exactly the angry handwriting absolutely would definitely be highly forensically authenticated. Exactly the highly secure access logs absolutely would definitively identify exactly who physically entered exactly the highly locked archive. Exactly the highly suspicious missing folder absolutely would definitively be ruthlessly traced. Completely until exactly that actively happened. Absolutely nobody actively connected entirely to Camilla's highly powerful household absolutely would absolutely ever actively touch exactly the massive Diana program completely again. Anne intensely looked entirely toward Catherine. Exactly the beautiful ceremony had absolutely never, ever actually completely been exactly the absolute true target. Exactly the absolute true target was exactly succession completely through highly powerful memory. Diana directly entirely to William, William directly entirely to Catherine, Catherine directly entirely to Charlotte. Absolutely someone highly ambitious had aggressively tried entirely to forcefully break exactly that powerful line completely before exactly the entire watching world could ever see exactly it. Absolutely now William deeply knew, and exactly the highly toxic sentence Charlotte bravely refused entirely to actively read was absolutely about entirely to completely change absolutely everything. Exactly the highly tense room stubbornly stayed completely silent completely after William finally finished actively reading. Catherine absolutely did completely not actively ask entirely to actively see exactly the highly toxic sentence completely again. She had deeply understood exactly enough completely from exactly the highly specific way William angrily folded exactly the heavy page, exactly the highly specific way Anne's rigid jaw visibly tightened, and exactly the highly specific way absolutely every single highly placed official actively connected entirely to Camilla's massive household abruptly became incredibly, terrifyingly careful completely with exactly their chosen words. Exactly then, William aggressively unfolded exactly it. Exactly the highly disputed toxic line coldly read, Diana must absolutely not be actively allowed entirely to completely eclipse exactly the Queen completely again. Aggressively remove Catherine's beautiful tribute and actively keep exactly the girl completely away, entirely from exactly the absolute center, exactly the girl, absolutely not Princess Charlotte, absolutely not William's beloved daughter, absolutely not Diana's only granddaughter, exactly the girl, exactly that highly dismissive, cold phrase, completely changed exactly the fundamental meaning entirely of absolutely everything exactly that had previously happened completely before. Exactly the aggressively altered schedule was absolutely no longer exactly a highly dry, boring disagreement completely about minor timing. Exactly, it was absolutely no longer entirely possible, entirely to cowardly hide, completely behind fake ceremonial balance or highly manufactured administrative confusion. Exactly the highly toxic wording brutally revealed exactly a massive deep-seated fear, exactly that Diana's incredibly powerful, enduring memory absolutely would seamlessly move completely through Catherine and Charlotte completely in exactly a highly specific way, absolutely no grand title, absolutely could absolutely ever possibly control. Catherine intensely looked entirely toward exactly her brave daughter. Charlotte had absolutely not deeply known exactly the absolute full, highly toxic sentence. She had absolutely only actually seen exactly the angry beginning, completely on exactly the highly damaged, torn copy. Absolutely now she deeply understood exactly why exactly the absolute final, highly toxic version had completely been heavily hidden and exactly why, exactly, her exhausted mother had bravely carried exactly the massive loss, incredibly quietly. She had absolutely not merely completely been awkwardly moved, completely down exactly a boring procession. She had completely been aggressively pushed completely away entirely from exactly a massive, vital legacy. William coldly asked exactly who had maliciously written exactly the highly toxic line. Absolutely nobody actively answered completely in exactly that highly tense room. Camilla's highly panicked representatives frantically insisted exactly the angry handwriting absolutely required massive formal verification. Exactly they aggressively said exactly one rogue person absolutely could completely not officially speak entirely for exactly an absolute entire massive household. William coldly agreed completely with exactly one highly specific part entirely of exactly that frantic response. Exactly the angry writing absolutely would definitely be heavily, highly forensically examined. Exactly the massive circulation trail absolutely would definitely be ruthlessly, thoroughly checked. Absolutely every single specific person exactly who physically handled exactly the highly toxic document absolutely would definitely be explicitly identified. But exactly the beautiful ceremony absolutely would completely not actively wait. William decisively, formally restored Catherine's highly personal, beautiful introduction. Charlotte's highly symbolic place directly entirely beside exactly the final poignant rose was completely, officially returned. Exactly the incredibly moving film entirely about Diana's massive work was aggressively placed completely back, directly, entirely, into exactly the official program. Absolute final, ultimate approval, officially returned entirely to William and Catherine's absolute own office, and absolutely no further massive change absolutely could absolutely ever actively be completely made, completely without absolutely both formal signatures. Anne coldly added exactly one highly specific, unyielding instruction entirely of exactly her absolute own. Absolutely every single massive future alteration explicitly had entirely to actively be formally recorded directly entirely beside exactly the highly specific name, entirely of exactly the specific person actively requesting exactly it. Absolutely no highly vague initials, absolutely no highly obscure office codes, absolutely no cowardly hiding completely behind exactly the massive faceless household, exactly the highly tense room deeply understood exactly what Anne was aggressively doing. She was absolutely not entirely only fiercely protecting exactly one beautiful tribute. She was aggressively, permanently closing exactly the highly toxic, obscure method, exactly that had completely allowed exactly the malicious changes entirely to seamlessly move completely through exactly the massive system completely without absolutely any accountability. Catherine quietly remained incredibly quiet, completely, until exactly the terrified officials finally left. Exactly then, she softly turned entirely to Charlotte. Exactly, there was absolutely no hot anger completely in exactly her exhausted face. Absolutely only exactly the profound exhaustion entirely of exactly a loving mother tragically realizing exactly her brave child had heavily spent exactly 18 incredibly long days deeply believing she actively had entirely to frantically solve exactly a massive, highly toxic adult problem completely alone. Catherine gently told exactly that true courage absolutely did, completely not, absolutely always exactly mean actively speaking, completely and highly public. Sometimes true courage deeply meant actively choosing exactly the absolute right, highly specific moment, deeply trusting exactly the absolute right, highly specific people, and profoundly understanding exactly the massive, heavy cost entirely of exactly a highly sensitive truth completely before actively releasing exactly it. Charlotte softly asked exactly whether she had poorly chosen exactly the absolute wrong, highly specific moment. Catherine gently shook exactly her head. She softly said exactly the absolute wrong, highly specific moment had tragically come long weeks incredibly earlier, exactly when highly powerful adults clearly saw exactly what was aggressively happening and cowardly decided exactly that highly toxic silence was significantly easier. Exactly that deeply honest answer completely broke exactly the absolute last remaining distance completely between exactly them. Charlotte softly admitted she had completely been incredibly afraid. Catherine absolutely would completely be deeply ashamed entirely of exactly her. Catherine gently pulled exactly her incredibly close and softly told exactly the deep shame absolutely belonged completely entirely elsewhere. William quietly watched completely without actively interrupting and quietly stood entirely near exactly the massive table, exactly one large hand quietly resting directly entirely beside exactly two wildly different versions entirely of exactly the official program. Exactly the undeniable evidence had completely done significantly more entirely than simply expose exactly a highly hidden, malicious instruction. Exactly it had brutally revealed exactly a massive, ongoing contest completely over enduring memory, massive influence, and exactly the highly specific future public image entirely of exactly the ancient monarchy. Diana's highly sensitive anniversary was completely supposed entirely to respectfully look completely backward. Absolutely instead, exactly, it brutally exposed exactly what was aggressively coming exactly next. Exactly a highly specific future, completely in exactly which Catherine absolutely would completely not meekly accept. Absolutely every single incredibly quiet humiliation simply entirely to artificially preserve absolutely someone exactly else's fragile comfort. Exactly a highly specific future, completely in exactly which Charlotte deeply understood, exactly that strict royal duty absolutely did, completely not ever explicitly require willingly surrendering exactly her absolute own strong voice. and exactly a highly specific future completely in exactly which William absolutely would aggressively demand highly specific names, formal signatures, and undeniable proof completely before ever allowing absolutely any massive household entirely to maliciously alter exactly the highly protected legacy entirely of exactly his beloved mother. Camilla's highly panicked office quickly, aggressively denied exactly that. Exactly the highly toxic sentence accurately reflected exactly her absolute own personal wishes. Absolutely no highly public screaming confrontation actually followed exactly that highly tense evening. Absolutely no grand title officially changed. Absolutely no highly formal announcement explicitly named exactly a specific culprit, but completely inside exactly the highly private family, exactly the massive undeniable damage had completely, permanently been done. William absolutely now securely held absolutely both highly toxic pages and securely held exactly the highly sensitive archive record. Charlotte undeniably had exactly the absolute entire public's massive attention, and Catherine had finally completely stopped painfully carrying exactly the massive pain completely alone. Exactly the highly sanitized official story, completely from Camilla's frantic side, is exactly that. Exactly. This was absolutely all simply exactly a highly unfortunate misunderstanding, exactly a completely discarded, harmless proposal, exactly that. Absolutely should absolutely never, ever actively have accidentally reached Charlotte's highly restricted folder. But exactly when absolutely you actually meticulously look completely at exactly what was officially said, absolutely versus exactly what undeniably happened, exactly that flimsy explanation completely, utterly falls apart. Exactly the highly toxic document absolutely wasn't exactly an incredibly early, harmless draft. Exactly, it was highly deliberately created completely after exactly the absolute original beautiful program was officially finally approved. Exactly, it absolutely wasn't exactly a single, highly anomalous copy simply sitting entirely in absolutely someone's dusty desk. Exactly, it explicitly had exactly a highly specific fourth massive distribution circulation code and exactly a highly specific matching entry completely in exactly the highly secure master register. Exactly, it absolutely wasn't completely unsigned. Exactly, it explicitly had highly specific initials and exactly a highly formal approval mark. And exactly the highly suspicious missing file, completely in exactly the highly secured archive, exactly the highly specific one, exactly that had completely been physically removed, strongly suggests absolutely someone intimately knew exactly, precisely exactly what was completely in exactly that highly toxic folder and desperately tried entirely to aggressively make exactly it magically disappear completely before absolutely anyone could ever actively compare exactly the conflicting versions. Exactly the undeniable fact, exactly that Anne flawlessly found exactly a highly hidden duplicate completely behind absolutely another boring program explicitly means exactly the frantic cleanup absolutely wasn't completely perfectly complete. Absolutely someone got incredibly sloppy or absolutely someone got abruptly interrupted. Absolutely either highly likely way, exactly the undeniable evidence absolutely now permanently exists completely in multiple highly secure forms, and William has completely secured absolutely all entirely of exactly it. Exactly what actually makes exactly this highly explosive situation absolutely so incredibly difficult entirely to casually dismiss is exactly that. Exactly the highly toxic note absolutely didn't simply aggressively target Catherine. Exactly it viciously targeted Charlotte entirely by highly specific name, or absolutely rather entirely by coldly refusing entirely to actively use exactly her highly specific name. Actively keep exactly the girl completely away, entirely from exactly the absolute center. Exactly that is absolutely not exactly dry administrative language. Exactly that is incredibly, deeply personal. Exactly it strongly suggests exactly that. Absolutely whoever maliciously wrote exactly this absolutely wasn't simply coldly adjusting exactly a boring ceremony. Exactly, they were aggressively trying entirely to actively prevent exactly a highly specific, powerful image completely from ever forming. Diana's only granddaughter proudly carrying exactly the final poignant rose, confidently standing directly entirely beside exactly her loving mother, warmly introduced completely by exactly the highly beloved woman, exactly who happily married Diana's devoted son. Exactly that specific image absolutely would have completely been incredibly, undeniably powerful, and exactly it absolutely would have powerfully reminded absolutely everyone intently watching exactly whose highly protected legacy was truly actively being highly honored. Exactly the undeniable fact exactly that absolutely someone highly placed completely in Camilla's ambitious orbit clearly saw exactly that specific beautiful image exactly as exactly a massive terrifying threat explicitly tells exactly you absolutely everything entirely about exactly how incredibly closely Diana's enduring memory is absolutely still actively being heavily managed completely inside exactly that massive family. And exactly, here's exactly the highly specific part exactly that absolutely, really, truly, permanently sticks completely with exactly me. Charlotte bravely sat completely on exactly this massive secret entirely for exactly 18 incredibly long days. She painfully watched exactly her exhausted mother flawlessly pretend absolutely everything was perfectly fine. She painfully watched exactly the beautiful program actively get aggressively dismantled piece completely by piece. She patiently waited entirely for absolutely someone exactly else entirely to aggressively step completely in, and absolutely nobody actively did. So she bravely walked completely onto exactly a highly public stage, explicitly in front entirely of national cameras, and boldly did exactly it completely herself. Exactly that is absolutely not exactly a petulant child selfishly acting completely out. Exactly that is exactly an incredibly observant child, exactly who deeply realized exactly the highly powerful adults completely around exactly her had cowardly decided exactly that highly toxic silence was significantly safer entirely than exactly the highly uncomfortable truth. And exactly when Catherine finally completely heard exactly what exactly her brave daughter had actively done, she absolutely didn't quietly cry entirely because she was publicly embarrassed. She quietly cried entirely because she deeply understood exactly that, exactly her young daughter had completely been painfully carrying exactly the immense weight entirely of exactly something massive Catherine had desperately tried entirely to fiercely protect exactly her completely from. Exactly the absolute whole massive thing is exactly a highly tragic mess entirely of incredibly good intentions violently colliding completely with massive crushing institutional pressure and completely at exactly the absolute exact center entirely of exactly it are exactly two innocent people exactly who were simply actively trying entirely to respectfully honor Diana completely in exactly a highly specific way, exactly that genuinely felt incredibly real, exactly the absolute next massive development completely in exactly this highly explosive story is apparently absolutely going entirely to definitively reveal exactly the highly specific name entirely of exactly the specific person, exactly who officially approved exactly the absolute final massive circulation exactly at 6:47 p.m., exactly that highly tense evening, completely along completely with exactly three highly toxic words handwritten directly entirely beside Camilla's highly private office code. exactly those exactly three highly toxic words absolutely may definitively explain exactly who arrogantly expected Catherine entirely to meekly remain incredibly silent completely forever. Entirely, if exactly that's undeniably completely true. Exactly, then exactly this absolutely isn't simply entirely about exactly a beautiful tribute. Exactly, it is entirely about exactly whether absolutely anyone completely in exactly that highly powerful household absolutely will actually, finally, completely be legally held strictly accountable entirely for aggressively trying, entirely to maliciously erase Diana's incredibly powerful presence completely from exactly her absolute own highly sensitive anniversary. Exactly, the highly secure investigation is completely open. Exactly, the massive documents are completely secured, and exactly the explosive story is incredibly far completely from totally finished. But entirely for absolutely now, exactly the highly specific image exactly that permanently lingers is Catherine proudly standing directly entirely beside exactly that large stage, tightly holding exactly a highly toxic folded page, firmly against exactly her heaving chest, exactly while exactly her brave daughter completely refuses entirely to actively read exactly the highly toxic sentence, exactly that absolutely would have brutally hurt exactly her absolute most. Exactly that is exactly the absolute defining moment. Absolutely everything fundamentally shifted. Absolutely not entirely because completely of exactly what was actively said, but entirely because completely of exactly what was absolutely finally completely understood.